So this lecture is from 1968, and it's called "There Is No Fiction." I think this lecture is, I would claim it's pretty famous. I think a lot of people know this lecture. I would recommend you study it as well. It's in the description if you want to read it. But he starts off this lecture by actually defining fiction. He says fiction is defined, and I think he's quoting probably the dictionary. It says an imaginary construction, fabrication, as opposed to the truth or reality. So it's a fabrication. It opposes truth and reality, which is what you should not do, as we're told constantly. You should not do this. But then he goes on to say, but the distinction between what is real and what is imaginary is one that cannot fully be maintained, for all existing things are in a sensible sense imaginary. That's his claim. And then he goes on and gives a scripture from chapter 11 from Mark, and he speaks about how they passed this fig tree, and then Christ curses the fig tree. And then he goes on to say how that imaginary act had no support in any fact, and yet it was cursed the following day. So the imaginary proved itself in performance the following day. So it sort of gives this idea that there might be a time interval in between. But he's basically saying that he's really big on this lecture about imagining without any supports in any facts. That's what he's really big on. And he goes on to say, prayer is adjusting oneself to the feeling of the wish fulfilled. That's our task. And I find that the word adjusting to be the most important. And I hope you caught that as well. The word adjusting oneself to the feeling. We're adjusting ourselves. That's a beautiful way of saying it. So you're not forcing yourself. Adjust yourself to feel that wish fulfilled. Feel that you already have that which you desire. Adjust yourself to that. You might not be used to it, but adjust it. Your imagination or inside of yourself, you may have always rearranged your imagination in such a way that always convinced you that you couldn't have, be, see, feel, whatever it is you desire. You always held some restriction, you always put yourself in some bondage, but adjust yourself to the feeling of, that's what he says prayer is. Prayer is adjusting oneself to the feeling of the wish fulfilled. So before you sleep tonight, try to adjust yourself. And he says, so I orient myself towards the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and then I accept that invisible state as reality. I go on my way paying no attention to it and no occasion to repeat it. I did it, and therefore I'm not surprised when it comes to pass. So he actually states in this case that Neville, a lot of the time, I had a question come up. They said, Neville sometimes says to repeat it over and over and over again, and other times he says he doesn't repeat it at all. And someone asked him this question. This was a question asked him. Actually, they asked him that exact question, just almost word for word. And he said, well, if I've ever said to repeat it, it's because other people have sent me their success stories and they repeated it. He says, but I don't repeat it. I don't do that personally. So for him, he was okay with it being sort of, as he said, I adjust myself to the wish fulfilled, and then I accept that invisible state as reality, and I go on my way of paying no attention to it, no occasion to repeat it. I did it, and therefore I'm not surprised when it comes to pass. That's how he prayed. And for a lot of the people in his book, The Law and the Promise, they were repeating it over and over and over again every night. So I think you can do either or. I actually prefer to do it the way Neville does it, personally, my own way. I have no real interest in repeating it over and over again. I do what he says. I accept the invisible state, or I say unseen. I don't say invisible, but it means the same thing. The unseen state is reality. I accept what is within me, otherwise unseen by my mortal eyes. I accept that as reality. And that is true. I go on my way believing that. I accept it. I accept that I've changed. I accept that I am that. I trust it. Another way of saying accept is I trust it. I trust that state as reality. That invisible state is reality. And then he says, we're trying to learn how to pray. So some people pray differently. But really the cause comes down to your acceptance within yourself. The imaginal act is what he's saying. The reason why he says that is because he's trying to get you to see that you don't need any outside adjustments or outside facts to conform to your imaginal act. The imaginal act's enough. It's enough to produce a change in your world. And so then he kind of sums it up here. I'm going to quote it. He says, so the whole vast world's an imaginal world. For if my assumption, not based upon any external evidence to support it, can produce evidence in the world to support it, well, then I must conclude, if the imaginal act produces external evidence to support it, then this world in which I live must be essentially imaginal. How else could you conclude? He goes, so if I dare to assume At what the moment my reason denies, what my senses deny, and walk faithful in my assumption, believing in the reality of my unseen state, and it produces a corresponding effect in my world, well then the outer world that seems so solidly real is anything other than imaginal. And so that's his claim. That's his conclusion. And he goes on to quote Blake, says, man is all imagination and God is man, exists in us and we in him. Again, he's going back to the idea that your imaginal self is your real self. So what you are in imagination is what you will become in this world. It's what you are. Another way of saying is that, what I think I become, right? That's another way of saying it. But in this case, we're using, instead of think, what I am inside. A lot of the time, people ask, what should I do? What should I do? And Neville actually gives you an answer. He says, a lot of people come to me and they ask me, what should they do? How should they assume? When really they should be asking is, what am I? What am I being? That's really the question. Because what I am is what I'm always going to bump into in my world. Because we always bump into our imaginal selves. Because man creates himself out of his own imagination. And then he goes on to say how, he says, you cannot feed the mind of man knowing that all things are imaginal and not produce it. All day long as I turn it on, a child sees it, and then the child thinks that this is the way of life. And right there, he's speaking actually about the news. He's saying that you can't feed millions upon millions of people violence on these televisions and not expect people to have that be produced in their life. I mean, that cannot be more relevant than today. And then and this was in 1968, so you can kind of contrast it with our time, and our time has much more media in our day than his day. But you cannot expect to put things in the mind of people and it not produce after its own kind. It has to. And it goes on to say, he says, you cannot entertain the thoughts of grandeur or the thoughts of being a martyr and not become it. So it's really our choice. It's our choice whether or not we want to take upon. These are just states. You have to see it again. You have to see this as states. If you see this anything as more states, then if you don't see it as the imagination in you has fallen into states, and you take it as you are that state, and you can't get out of it, then you will feel stuck inside. But you have to see it as the imagination enters the flesh and falls into or finds itself into states. And if you do catch yourself and you fell into a state you don't want to be in, you can get yourself out of it. Even if it feels like quicksand, even if it feels like you're sinking into and you can't get yourself out of it, you can. You can get out of a state if you find yourself in it that you don't like. Remember, I have a video called No Be No's. You have to learn to say no to things inside of you and actually let it be a no. Scripture teaches that to when you say no to something inside, let it be a no. Don't argue with yourself. Don't persuade yourself of the opposite. Don't think you have to imagine what you don't want to imagine. If his premise is right, what he's suggesting, that if what I imagine produces evidence in my world, then I have to conclude this world is ultimately imaginary. What else could I conclude? That this world might be an effect and not a cause, a shadow, not a light. I'd have to conclude that. And if that's the case, how do I go about living upon a dream? Essentially, how do I go about living in a dream? What do I do if I need to change the dream? If I need to change the shadow, what do? Do I change the shadow? No, I change the direction of the light. I change what my attention's at if I want to change my imagination. I change what I'm being inside if I want to change what I am. I don't need anybody to support it. I don't need other people to agree with me. I don't even need them to like me. I just need to adjust myself within myself. And as he said, it's a self-persuasion. So how do I persuade myself that I am what I want to be? I need to find a way. If it comes down to belief, how can I get myself to believe that I am what I want to be? He goes on to say he accepts the unseen as real. That's what he does. And I found that that's the way to do it. From my own experience, that's the way to change. I mean, actually change. Actually change to where it starts to affect your reality, where you start to see the effects of yourself in your reality. That's what I mean. You actually start to see the evidence appear in your world. And you know that evidence came from within first. It had no support of your senses. It had no support of the words of people around you, the mouths of people. No support of anyone around you. No one believed in it. No support of your of your past, and yet you believed in this imaginal act and it came to pass, what would you conclude? So then he goes on to say, he's talking about God. He says, so he creates out of nothing. He calls a thing that is not seen as though it were seen. So he's saying that that you don't need anything on the outside. It comes out of nothing. It creates out of nothing. He says, so how does he call it? He calls it by an imaginal construction. He says, what would it be like were it true? And then he rearranges the structure of his mind. Then he looks now at that structure. It implies the fulfillment of his desire, and that structure projects itself on the screen of space. We call the projection reality, and we think it was born of an entirely different way, but it wasn't. So there's always this invisible trace, invisible string that attaches itself, that if you take it all the way back, if you were to pull it, it would lead you towards the cause, which is your imagination. So although the facts might appear as physical realities, if you try to find their cause, you'll find it in something imaginary. So I'm going to end it here on this one. This is going to be part 1. I'm going to do a part 2, maybe a part 3 on this one. It depends on how long it goes. But I just want to thank everybody again for listening. I appreciate you guys, chiming in and giving me your ear and your time, because I do find this stuff fascinating. I can't think of something more interesting to speak about. And I just want to add that I am also doing live talking and Q&As as well. I know there's a lot of questions as well, but that'll be for the members channel. You can just look it up in the description and it'll be there. But yeah, I'd love to have you guys, and thank you guys for listening.